2 winters ago, I was paying for propane like it was a car payment. And I've got trees. I'm standing in the middle of a forest. I own a chainsaw. I've spent my whole life around wood. And I was buying a fossil fuel to keep warm. That bothered me in a way I couldn't quite let go of. What really got me was the delivery truck. Somebody drives out here on that road, which is not a fun road, to fill a tank so I can burn something that came from a long way away, while there is more energy standing within 100 yards of the building than I could use in a decade. Every time that truck came up the drive, I'd stand there doing arithmetic in my head and not liking the answer. So I built the thing I'm going to show you today, and it took most of a summer, and it cost me a few $100s and a lot of my back, and the propane bill for that building is now essentially zero. I'll show you how it works, how it's built, and because this is that kind of channel, the 4 or 5 things about it that nobody puts in the thumbnail. Subscribe if you want the version with the drawbacks left in. It's called a rocket mass heater. And before I show you the build, I need to explain why a regular wood stove is worse than you think, because that's the whole reason this thing exists. Here's the thing my grandfather Walt used to say, standing in front of a wood stove with his hands out. He'd say, "You're heating the sky." And he meant it as a grumble, not a physics lesson, but he was completely right. When you burn wood in an ordinary stove, you get flame and you get hot exhaust. The stove body radiates some of that heat into the room. But an enormous amount of it, the hot gas, which is where a very large share of the energy in that wood actually is, goes straight up the pipe and out the roof. You cut it, you split it, you hauled it, you stacked it, you dried it for a year, and then a big fraction of what you were after leaves the building in about 4 seconds. And it's worse than just waste, because that exhaust has to stay hot. A conventional stove needs a hot flue to keep the draft going and to keep creosote from condensing in the chimney. So the heat loss isn't an accident of bad design. It's load-bearing. The stove is required to throw money out the roof in order to work at all. Which is why damping a stove down doesn't solve it either, and I'd done that for years thinking I was being clever. Choke the air back to make a load of wood last overnight, and what you're actually doing is lowering the combustion temperature until the fire can't burn its own smoke, so you get less heat. And the unburned fuel goes up as smoke and condenses on the inside of your chimney as creosote, which is a chimney fire waiting for a cold snap. The slow, smoldering fire that feels thrifty is the least efficient and least safe way to run a stove. It took me an embarrassingly long time to work that out. The rocket mass heater does 2 things differently, and they're connected. First, it burns hot enough to finish the job. The combustion core is a J shape. You drop short pieces of wood down a vertical feed tube. The fire burns sideways along a horizontal tunnel, and then it goes up a tall, heavily insulated vertical riser. Because that riser is insulated rather than being a cold steel pipe, the temperature inside it climbs enormously, up in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 degrees. At those temperatures, the smoke itself, which is just unburned fuel, that's all smoke has ever been. Catches and burns. You get a second combustion happening in the riser of the stuff a normal stove sends up the chimney as smoke. That's also where the name comes from. The draft it generates is strong enough that the thing roars. Not a crackle, a roar, like a burner. The first time you hear it, you'll think something's wrong. Second, and this is the actual trick, it doesn't let the exhaust leave. Over the top of that riser sits a steel barrel with a gap between the riser top and the barrel lid. The gas hits the top, gives up a big slug of heat to the barrel. That's your immediate radiant heat, the part that warms the room right now, and then travels down the outside of the riser, cooling as it goes. By the time it reaches the bottom of the barrel, it's cool enough to do something no normal stove can do. Go sideways. And it goes sideways through 30-some feet of duct buried in several tons of cob. Clay, sand, straw, mixed and packed by hand. All that hot gas gives up nearly everything it has left to that mass on the way through, and what finally leaves the building is barely warm. That mass is the whole point. You burn for 2 or 3 hours in the evening, and the cob holds that heat and radiates it back into the room for the next day. Not blasting, just a steady warm surface you can sit on at about body temperature, hour after hour after the fire is long dead. All right, how I built it. The first thing, and I want to lead with it because it surprises people, this is heavy. A typical one runs 3 to 6 tons. My mass bench is somewhere around 4. That's a couple of cars parked in your living room, and you do not put that on a wood floor and hope. Mine sits on ground level over a compacted rubble footing that I dug and filled myself. If you're putting one in an existing building with a suspended floor, that's a real structural conversation with somebody who knows joists before you buy a single brick. The number people quote is somewhere around 120 to 200 pounds per square foot spread over the footprint, which sounds less alarming than 4 tons until you remember residential floors are typically designed for 40. It's not that it can't be done on a wood floor. People do it, with additional posts and beams underneath. It's that it's an engineering decision rather than an enthusiasm decision. Mine went on the ground specifically so I didn't have to have that conversation, and that constrained where in the building it could go, which is worth thinking about early rather than late. On top of the footing goes insulation, so you're not pumping heat into the ground. Then the core. The core is firebrick, proper high-duty firebrick, not the fake decorative stuff, set in a clay and sand mortar. Not Portland cement. Cement cracks and spalls at these temperatures. The feed tube is about 8 inches square and maybe 16 deep. The burn tunnel runs off the bottom of it horizontally, and the whole geometry matters more than you'd like. The cross-sectional area has to stay consistent all the way through, and the riser has to be substantially taller than the burn tunnel is long, or it won't draft and it'll smoke back at you out of the feed. I got that wrong the first time. I built a riser that was too short because I was worried about ceiling clearance, and I lit it. And it puffed smoke back out of the feed tube at me and sat there sulking. Had to tear it apart and rebuild it taller. That's not a disaster. It's a Saturday. But I'd rather you knew. And here's the thing that makes that mistake cheap instead of expensive. Build the core dry first. Stack the whole firebrick assembly with no mortar at all. Set the riser and the barrel on it loose. Take it outside or into an open space and light it. See if it drafts. See if it roars. Move the barrel gap up and down and watch what changes. It's a couple 100 pounds of brick you can pull apart and restack in 20 minutes at that stage. Once it's mortared and buried under 4 tons of cob, every one of those adjustments becomes a demolition project. I did the dry stack on my second attempt and not my first, which is exactly the wrong order and is why I'm mentioning it. The riser is the engine, and the insulation on it is what makes it an engine. Mine is a stainless liner wrapped in ceramic fiber blanket and then a perlite clay slip. What you're doing is refusing to let that column lose heat, because every degree you keep in there is a degree of combustion you get. If the riser is uninsulated, the whole thing degrades into a mediocre stove with extra steps. Then, the barrel. A plain 55-gallon steel drum, cut open at one end, set down over the riser with a gap at the top, a couple inches, and that gap is worth fiddling with. because too tight chokes it and too loose costs you draft. Sealed at the bottom with cob so no exhaust escapes into the room. And I'll say this plainly, the barrel gets extremely hot. Hot enough to burn you badly, hot enough to matter for clearances to anything combustible. That's the one part of this that behaves like a wood stove, and it needs to be treated like one. Off the bottom of the barrel, the duct. 8-inch stovepipe, running out into the bench and then to the chimney. Use black stovepipe rather than galvanized for the first stretch coming off the barrel where it's hottest, since galvanizing gives off fumes you don't want when it gets hot enough. Sealed at every joint, and I mean actually sealed, high-temp sealant and foil tape. Because a leak in that duct is exhaust in your house, and I'll come back to that. Then the cob, and the cob is the part that takes forever. Clay, sand, and straw mixed on a tarp with your feet. You build up around the ducting a handful at a time, packing as you go, no voids. It's pleasant work for about the first day and a half. After that, it's just work. I dug the clay out of a bank on this property, so my material cost for several tons of thermal mass was zero and a lot of shovel time. If you've never mixed cob, the ratio is something you find rather than something you're told, because everybody's clay is different. Mine wanted roughly 2 parts sand to 1 part clay, but that's my dirt, not yours. Make a few test batches the size of a loaf of bread, let them dry a couple of days, and see which one cracks and which one crumbles. Too much clay and it shrinks and cracks as it dries. Too much sand and it never holds together. The straw isn't filler either, it's reinforcement, the same idea as rebar, and it's what keeps the cracks that do form from running. The other thing about cob is that it will consume more material than any estimate you make. I ran out of clay twice on a project where the clay was free and 40 feet away, which tells you something about how bad I am at estimating volume. Dig more than you think. It keeps fine under a tarp. One thing worth knowing, don't bury the duct too deep or too shallow. Heat moves through cob at roughly 1 inch an hour, so a couple inches of cover means the bench gets warm about 2 hours after you light it and stays warm long after. Bury it a foot deep and you'll never feel it. That number is worth designing around. Then you let it dry. Weeks, small fires only at first, because a big fire in a wet mass will steam and crack it. That drying period is longer than anybody wants it to be, and it's the reason to build this in spring or early summer rather than in October, when you've suddenly noticed it's cold. 4 tons of wet earth gives up its water slowly. You'll get hairline cracks regardless, and most of them are cosmetic and you just rub a bit of fresh cob into them with your thumb. What you're avoiding with the slow start is the big structural crack you get from driving steam out of the middle too fast. I'd like to hear from anybody who's actually run one of these through a winter. Tell me in the comments how it did in the coldest stretch. Because my experience is one building in one climate, and I'd like a wider sample than that. The first real burn is a strange thing. You prime it, light a bit of paper down near the base to get the column of air moving the right direction, and then feed it, and within a minute or two it catches its draft and starts to roar. Then you feed it short sticks for a couple hours, standing there, adding wood every 10 or 15 minutes. And the room doesn't get warm right away. The barrel does immediately. The bench takes hours. The first night I sat there at 9 o'clock thinking I'd built 4 tons of expensive furniture. Then I went out the next morning and the bench was still warm, 12 hours after the fire went out, and that's when I understood what I'd actually made. That's the adjustment nobody warns you about, and it's mental rather than technical. Every heating system I'd ever used, I understood through the fire. Fire big, room warm. Fire out, get cold. This one breaks that connection entirely. The fire is a thing you do in the evening to charge a battery, and the battery is what heats you, and the two are separated by half a day. It took me a few weeks to stop going out and checking on a fire that had been out since last night and was still, in the only way that mattered, working. There's also a sound thing. A wood stove is company. It ticks and pops and shifts. This roars for 2 hours and then goes completely silent while continuing to do its job, and a silent, warm room is a slightly eerie thing at first. Now the honest part. This did not replace a furnace. It replaced heating one open space, and it did that completely. What it does not do is move heat around a house. There's no fan, no ducting to other rooms, no thermostat. If you have a floor plan with hallways and doors, this heats the room it's in, and the rooms beyond it stay about how they were. Anybody telling you a rocket mass heater will heat a conventional multi-room house without additional work is skipping something. Part of that is just what radiant heat is. This thing warms surfaces and bodies rather than warming air and pushing it around, which is why the room feels comfortable at a lower air temperature than you'd expect. You're being warmed directly. The same way you are standing in sunshine on a cold day. That's a pleasant way to be warm. But radiant heat travels in straight lines and doesn't go around corners, so a wall is a wall, which means the building matters as much as the heater does. Mine works as well as it does, partly because it's a small, well-insulated, fairly open space. Put the identical heater in a big drafty house with the same amount of wood going through it, and you'd have a warm bench in a cold room, and you'd conclude the design doesn't work. It'd be the building. It's also slow, and slow cuts both ways. You cannot come home to a cold building and be warm in 15 minutes. It takes a day or more to bring a cold mass up to temperature at the start of the season. The flip side is that once it's up, it's remarkably steady and forgiving, and it'll ride through a couple of days of you being lazy about it. It needs tending. 2 or 3 hours of standing there feeding short pieces of wood. Some people find that miserable. I find it fine. It's the part of the day where I'm not doing anything else, but I'm not going to pretend it's a thermostat. And it's a poor fit for anybody who's away from the building for long stretches, or for a household where nobody's home in the evening, which is worth an honest look before you move 4 tons of dirt. The wood, though, the wood is the part that actually stunned me. It burns small stuff, branches, limbwood, thinnings, the material I used to leave in slash piles because it wasn't worth bucking into firewood. It doesn't want big rounds, and it doesn't need 2 years of seasoning on hardwood. Compared to what I was feeding a conventional stove, it's a fraction. People cite figures like 70 to 90% less wood for the same heat. And while I never measured mine properly, it's not a small difference, it's an obvious one. That's the real cost saving. Not the propane bill alone, but the fact that the fuel is stuff I was already generating and used to consider waste. It changed how I look at a slash pile, which I did not expect. I've made a video before about not splitting firewood until you're ready to burn it. And the whole logic there is about handling big rounds efficiently. This is nearly the opposite problem. I now want the small material, the 4-foot tops and the limbwood, cut to about 16 inches and stacked somewhere dry. Stuff that used to be a disposal question is now the fuel supply, and the disposal question and the heating question turned out to be the same question wearing 2 hats. The wood does have to be dry, though, properly dry. Wet wood in this thing doesn't just burn poorly, it drops the temperature in the riser, and once the riser cools, you lose the secondary combustion that the whole design depends on. So you get smoke, and a sulky fire, and none of the efficiency you built the thing for. And now the part I'd feel bad leaving out. Check your code and call your insurance company before you build one of these, not after. Here's the problem. And it isn't about whether the thing is safe. A site-built masonry heater has no UL listing and no EPA certification, because there's no certification program for something you build yourself out of brick. Many jurisdictions require a solid fuel appliance to be listed or certified, full stop. And an inspector who asks for the make and model has no box to put you in. Insurers vary a lot. Some won't touch a home-built burner. Some will if you have another heat source in the building. Some will want an inspection. Those are all findable answers. Find them in June. There's an irony in it that I've made my peace with but still find funny. The reason insurers get nervous about wood heat is chimney fires, and chimney fires come from creosote, and creosote comes from incomplete combustion and cool smoke. This design produces less creosote than a conventional stove because it burns the smoke instead of sending it up the pipe. The thing that makes it safer on that specific count is the same thing that makes it unlistable. It's a procedural problem, not a physics problem, and knowing that doesn't help you at all when you're on the phone with an underwriter. Ask anyway. In some areas, the answer is easier than you'd expect, particularly if it isn't your only heat source. And the safety items, which are not optional. Carbon monoxide detectors, more than one, and test them. That entire exhaust path is under your control and inside your building, and unlike a wood stove, there's a long horizontal run where a bad joint or a cracked bench can leak. Keep proper clearance from anything combustible, especially around that barrel. Have a real chimney at the end of it, tall enough to draft. And build a cleanout you can actually get to. Because ash does collect at the base of the riser and in the first stretch of duct. And once a year, you want to be able to open it up and vacuum it out rather than wondering. So, did it destroy my heating bill? For that building, yes, and I'd do it again tomorrow. But the honest version of the sentence is longer. It cost me a summer, 4 tons of dirt moved by hand, 1 rebuild after I got the riser wrong, and it heats 1 space rather than a house. What I keep coming back to is Walt in front of that stove with his hands out, grumbling about heating the sky. He never did anything about it. He just complained about it every winter for 40 years, which is its own kind of tradition. I think he'd have liked this. I think he'd have also said it was an awful lot of mud for a man to move on purpose. I'll put a couple videos up here for you. If there's interest, I'll do one on the burn itself and what a full winter looked like. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.